Welcome to the Expanding Worlds podcast. I'm your host, Deborah Caldo. This is the final episode in the Housing Options series, where I want to explore what the common themes were across the series and talk about some of the ideas that might help all of us decide what's right for our children. I want to start off by saying this isn't a summary, so if you haven't already listened to the episodes, please go and have a listen, because obviously my guests can tell their story much more succinctly than I can. I should also explain before we go any further the motivation for this particular series. I looked around at many of my friends and I see them in that, I guess, what you call empty nest place where their children have already left home or are in the process of leaving home, going to college or getting a job, moving in with friends. And then I hear my friends talk about what they're going to do now. But I'm not in that position yet because my daughter, although her independent skills are really building and she's doing amazingly well, and lots of things are starting to come together around purpose and daily living and even relationships, the idea of her living away from the family home isn't something that's just about to happen. I suppose we're still grappling with that in terms of how that might look and what will be a good solution for her. So we have a vision worked out for her, of course, and long term we actually have a pretty good plan in place. But we haven't quite got to that stage yet where she's moved into a place of her own. And I think that when I talk to other people, to other parents, that makes me reflect. And in comparison to many of my friends, actually my journey is quite different. So I wanted to do a housing options series because it interests me. And that's pretty much how I've always run the podcast, to be fair, to address the issues that are coming up for me and for my family, because I think they're the same issues that we all think about. But of course, it's always important to say that I don't know your child and I don't know what they need. So I can only ever talk from my own lived experience. I can't talk from yours. But I will say there were some things that I found in the series, in these episodes, that made me sit back and think about my preconceptions about my own daughter and made me aware of some options that I hadn't even known existed. I want to start, though, by talking about what we actually already know. One of the episodes was focused on a research project which looked at the quality of supported living and residential care, or group homes. And although the research was based in England, it doesn't take a lot to imagine that the issues raised would be very similar around the world. What Chris and Lauren, who were involved in the research, talked about were those common themes, like the importance of feeling safe, and this was often determined by location, also access to things that people wanted to do and friends they wanted to go and see. It's unlikely my daughter will ever drive, so being near public transport is a necessity for her. But that won't work, obviously, if she's a long way from where her job is. And that was the case for one of the people in the research. They'd had to give up their job because it was too difficult to travel by public transport to their place of work. Given how hard it is to get a job in the first place for our young people, that really is upsetting to hear. Choice was also a big issue in terms of choosing who they lived with. If you ever lived in a place with anyone you didn't get along with, then you'll understand the impact that can have on your life. And related to this was the idea that people wanted the choice of changing where they live in the future. We all change, our circumstances change, so it's wrong to assume that a person might stay in the one place forever. But it seems to be something that we do. Of course, for some people that will work, but it's still about choice. And for some of the people spoken to in the research, they didn't feel that they had a choice. And it's damning, I think, that people were saying, I didn't want to complain. I didn't want to say this neighbourhood was bad because I didn't know where it'd end up and things like that. That's just a fundamental lack of respect for people. That's not a choice. That's basically saying to someone, this is your choice, and that's it. That's not a choice, and that's just unacceptable, whoever you are. But the main theme that came back through the research was that satisfaction with where people lived was built on community. Where there was community, people felt safe, they felt involved, they felt part of the community, they were recognised in the community, and that's when they were happiest. But the big question I think we ask as parents, as families, before anything else, is how our children would live without us and get the support they need. And let's be honest, we're probably in the position of providing most of that support at the moment. And when I spoke to Jonathan from Synthetic Housing, who do provide supported living services, it was very clear that having the right type and level of support in place was very important in ensuring that the placement worked, that the person was happy in where they lived. And around support, one of the ideas I really liked was what happens at Main Street, where their mantra is bring your own independence. This is the idea that everyone who comes to live at Main Street decides what support they need and they bring it with them. In some ways, this makes it easier for the housing provider, but this is also about choice for the person, as it's 100% up to them to bring what they need with them. So rather than having their support integrated, it's really about understanding that everyone will need different levels of support. So if you're providing good quality, accessible, inclusive housing, then people can come into that housing and bring the additional support that they need. Now, there's clearly lots of caveats around that, like funding and staffing, but I think it's a new type of approach with lots of benefits. And it wasn't surprising when Gillian from Main Street said that the impact of this had often been that people were thinking more deeply about what support they really needed to bring. And they ended up bringing and wanting to have less support in place. So Bring Your Own Independence became focused on independence, not on support. And this was an idea that was also mentioned by Donna and Paula from Our Stomping Ground, where they talked about the fact that by giving people choice of having support, they often start to realise that maybe they don't need it or they actually don't want it. So this is really about enabling people to say, what do I need to access a particular activity or to live by myself? And sometimes, as you'll know yourself, when you're put in a position of having to do something new, often you surprise yourself by just getting on and dealing with it. And I've spoken here before about how often my daughter surprises me and does things that I hadn't thought she was ready to do. So I think it's really about enabling the individual and giving them the option to decide for themselves. And it also does come back to what we talked about in the Our Stomping Ground episode, this idea of dignity of risk. Whether I'm comfortable with it or not, my daughter has the right to make her own mistakes. I didn't stop her sister doing some of the things that I now want to stop her doing. Yes, there is increased vulnerability. I'm aware of that, but there's also ways I can mitigate the risks. And it comes back to letting go and remembering that I'm not always going to be there to mitigate those risks. So it's better she learns from the experience now while I'm there to catch her if she does fall. And often, as Gillian talked about, it's only with opportunities to start using some skills that people realise that they had those skills all along. And I think there's also an element as well, when you see other people doing things, you think to yourself, well, maybe I could do it as well. So being in that sort of environment where other people are being more independent, perhaps for some young people will encourage them to bring their own independence as well. But at Our Stomping Ground, they actually took that support idea even further, and they have a housing first approach where instead of wondering if a young person has all the skills to live in a place of their own, they move in and then the support that they need is built around them as the needs that they have are identified. And as Donna from Our Stomping Ground said, and I have to agree with this one, if she'd waited until she thought her daughter was ready to move into a place of her own, it would have happened after her funeral. That certainly resonated with me. But of course, it would be ignorant if I didn't mention one of the big issues when it comes to housing, and that's finding the actual house itself. Some of the options in this series do require some money. Certainly in the UK, there's a housing shortage, and that obviously brings its own challenges. But there are other factors at play here as well, I think. I think there's a lot of stereotyping and expectations around the kinds of housing that people with additional needs should go and live in. Lisa, who works with people looking to provide supported living accommodation in the UK, has said as much in terms of how difficult it is to provide homes for people with additional needs because financial institutions have outdated ideas around what people with additional needs will be like, what they need, how vulnerable they might be, and that's making it more difficult for people to provide housing. But if you listen to the Main Street and Our Stomping Ground episodes, you at least get some optimism that the funding is out there. It's certainly not easy, but it can be done. And Lisa at US Autism Homes mentioned one family that she was aware of that did some crowdfunding. But as I said, the overriding theme in the whole series was the importance of community. So how do we build that community around them? Well, there's clearly no simple or quick answer to that question, but it will start by us taking action. I don't know about you, but I'm still putting off some things that I want my daughter to do into that it'll happen one day box. But listening to all my guests who have taken action, I realise that I need to be more active, not reactive, in supporting her to have the future that she wants and that she deserves. But I also want to add here that I'm not on your journey, so you will do what you feel is right for your child. And I guess that's why so many of the episodes in this series were actually families coming up with their own solutions and supporting other parents to also come up with their own solutions. And letting go may look very different for you, as it did for Eliza when she created the Lonely Worm Farm for her son. But for my daughter, I believe she should and can live away from the family home in a place of her own. I would prefer that to be with other people, if I'm honest, as I worry about social isolation, but ultimately that will not be my decision. And there were a couple of ideas about building community that I believe are worth exploring more and things that I'll be looking into. Community can be built on existing foundations, as it's been done at US Autism Homes, where their 3-pillar solution involves working with a faith-based partner. Lisa made a very good point that these organisations have been around for a long time and will be around for a long time to come, so can provide a solid base on which to build their community. Mike Sweeney has also taken this road with his son, building a solution around an existing community. And interesting, as part of this, there is a cross-generational component. Given our changing demographics, I see that this is a model more of us will explore because the benefit for everyone involved is very clear. And another approach was the one that Kathy Meyer from Everyone Needs a Community talked about, which was microboards. I'm personally a big fan of this idea, as I've always found value in having other people mentor my daughter in certain areas. So what do I think needs to happen when it comes to housing? Well, given that most of the options in this series were created by families, then we are the answer. and we'll be the ones who find the right solution through sheer hard work and determination. The key, at least in my mind, is inclusion. And I think that inclusion is about making sure that all the housing options offered are located right at the centre of the wider community, whether that's a large community or a small community. It's not just about finding someone a place to live. That's not what it should be about. I think when it comes to housing, we need to be looking at the mental health aspect of things. We already know that our children are much more at risk of social isolation and loneliness. So where their housing is located becomes even more key. There are unfortunately several cases here in the UK of people being located a long way from where their family is. The reason is always given as availability of housing. But in this series, I've heard plenty of ideas that I see not even being considered by these people who decide where our young people can go and live. But ultimately, community needs the whole community to embrace that idea. And there's no doubt that's a continuing challenge. Because as Gillian at Main Street acknowledged, they still struggle to get everyone involved in their activities, their community activities, because the residents of Main Street are diverse, but the ones getting involved in the activities are from a narrower group of people, those people generally with additional needs. But inclusion is still built on visibility, where we learn about others who are different to us. And that starts at home, with my daughter living next door to you, to our neighbours, to our friends, becoming part of the community, and where she'll just get on with her life. Thank you for listening. I hope that you got some new ideas from this series and enjoyed listening to all my amazing guests sharing their solutions. I hope that one or two of these resonated with you and your family and gave you at least some optimism for the future. In the next series, I'm going to fly solo and explore in much more depth each of the 4 lines that have always been at the centre of the topics that the podcast has explored: daily living, relationships, purpose and financial security. I'll be talking about each of these 4 lines and how they're the basis on which my daughter's future has been built and is being built, and how that looks for each line. And if you've enjoyed this Housing Options series, please do share it with others you think will benefit. Leave a review wherever you listen to the podcast. That would be amazing. And of course, if you have any feedback or know anyone you think would make a great guest, I'd love to hear from you. You can get in touch, Deborah@expandingworlds.com, and you can send me a message. You can find me online at Deborah Caldo.